Well, welcome everyone. I want to thank you all for coming to join us today for the first in what will hopefully be a long and successful series of events entitled Inside the Scholar Studio, in which we'll be inviting various authors to come to campus and talk about their work today. And I want to thank especially the HDS Alumni Relations and Andover Harvard Theological Library for sponsoring this event today. So I want to start off by introducing our speaker, who probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Reza Aslan is an internationally acclaimed writer and scholar in the history of religions, serving currently as Associate Professor of Creative Writing and cooperating faculty in the Department of Religion at the University of California, Riverside. He holds a bachelor's degree in religious studies from Santa Clara University, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. I thought that might get some applause. And a PhD in the Sociology of Religions from the University of California, Santa Barbara, as well as a Master of Fine Arts from the University of Iowa, where he was named Truman Capote Fellow in Fiction. He is the founder of AslanMedia.com, an online journal for news and entertainment about the Middle East and the world, and co-founder and chief creative officer of BoomGen Studios, the premier entertainment brand for creative content from and about the greater Middle East. He serves on the board of directors for many nonprofits and NGOs working around the world. He is also a member of the inaugural cohort of the recipients of the Peter Gomes Memorial Honors, given by the HDS Alumni Council in April of 2013. Reza's first book is the international bestseller, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, which has been translated into 13 languages and named one of the 100 most important books of the last decade. He is also the author of How to Win a Cosmic War, published in paperback as Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in a Globalized Age, and is the editor of 2 volumes, Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East, and Muslims and Jews in America, Commonalities, Contentions, and Complexities. Most recently, he is the author of #1 New York Times bestseller Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, and he's here today to talk with us about this book. So welcome, Reza.
Thank you,
for
Jason.
joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Let me just say that this room looks so much cooler than it did when I was a student here, which I was thinking about on the way here. I woke up this morning and I thought, this is so awkward that I'm going to be talking to students. I mean, I just graduated from here. And it turns out, no, I didn't just graduate from here. That was 14 years ago. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you how long ago it was. I used to sleep in Div Hall. That tells you how long ago that was.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Reza. We're so happy to have you. I think what I want to start with today is, although many of us here will have read the book, or at least read about the book and have thought about it a lot, I just want to sort of give us a sense here of what first got you interested in this topic. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you might speak a little about the creation of the book. How did you first become interested in the life of Jesus? What interested you and inspired you to take up a book-length project about the topic for those who haven't yet had the chance to read it?
Well, I would say that I probably had a similar experience to a lot of people in this room. I mean, I often say that if you decide that you're going to dedicate your life to the study of religion, either you're crazy or you decided to do so originally from a place of faith, and then very quickly that faith was sucked out of you violently. But that same thing happened to me. I grew up in Iran. Very secular family, didn't really, we were Muslim in the sense that it was part of our identity, but when we came to the United States after the Iranian Revolution, which, if you remember the 80s, and some of you do, wasn't the best time to be Iranian or Muslim in the United States, and a lot has changed, apparently, in 30-something years. That's sarcasm. I really did everything that I could to kind of distance myself from the religion of my forefathers and the culture and heritage of Iran. In fact, as I often say, I spent a good part of the early 80s pretending to be Mexican. And so for me, I'd always been deeply interested in religion and spirituality, despite the fact that I didn't have any kind of spiritual education or religious experience. I think part of it had to do with the childhood images of revolutionary Iran that had really burned themselves in my consciousness. The power that religion has to transform a society for good and for bad is something that I've never been able to shake. But I never had an opportunity to express that in any kind of deep, meaningful, intellectual or spiritual way until when I was in high school, when I went to an evangelical youth camp and heard the gospel story for the first time. This sort of transformative experience of the converting to a particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity gave me my first opportunity to really express that deep longing for spiritual connection that I'd had most of my childhood. I went to Santa Clara University, a nice Jesuit Catholic university in the Bay Area, and there I began the formal study of the New Testament, and I had that experience that I think a lot of people in my situation have, where all of a sudden you realize, oh, most of what I was told was not right, that there's so much more, so much deeper that you can delve into the historical Jesus and the world in which he lived. And although eventually I did separate from Christianity and then ultimately did revert back to Islam many, many years later, again encouraged by my Catholic priest. So this is something that the Pope should not be aware of, is that the Jesuits are turning people away from Christianity and toward Islam. This is something that Glenn Beck would have a field day with. I continued delving into the New Testament, and I suppose the only way that I can put it is that the Jesus that I was discovering, this man who lived 2,000 years ago, and the world in which he lived became more real to me, became more interesting, more appealing. To put it in Christian terms, I wanted to have a personal relationship with this man in a way that I never could really get with the Christ that I had been introduced to in church. And so truly, if you're asking what was the impetus of this book, that was the moment. I wanted to let other people in on this experience that I had, this experience of being confronted with the historical Jesus.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great segue into the book, and I think I want to sort of get at what the heart of this book is about. You know, you talk about, you highlight actually throughout the book the importance of the crucifixion of Jesus as crucial for understanding his place within the Roman imperial context, but you do it in a slightly different way from the way many other people interpret it. You say, if one knew nothing else about Jesus of Nazareth, save that he was crucified by Rome, one would know practically all that was needed to uncover who he was, what he was, and why he ended up on a cross. Now, I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about the role that this crucifixion plays sort of in your argument and sort of the wider scope of your book? Why is it so significant for understanding the historical Jesus, and what role does it play in sort of, spinning out the central argument that you're trying to make?
Well, I mean, for the simple reason that crucifixion in this era was a punishment that Rome reserved almost exclusively for crimes against the state. So you have to start with this notion that Jesus was crucified as a state criminal, that he was crucified for sedition, for rebellion, insurrection. These are the crimes that crucifixion is used for. Crucifixion, of course, is not even really a form of capital punishment. I think that's an incorrect way to think about it. Rome would often kill you first and then crucify you. The purpose of crucifixion was primarily to act as a deterrent against rebellion, against insurrection. And so right away, that should at the very least begin to put a dent in this modern perception of Jesus as a kind of pacifistic preacher of good works with no interest in the cares of this world, whose kingdom was not of this world but of, in heaven. I think that, to be blunt, that Jesus would have probably gone unnoticed by Rome.
Absolutely. I think, it's so interesting how you sort of spin this out, and you really take us through a lot of historical textual materials, including the four Gospels. And something you say in your book that really interested me was you say, the only means the modern reader has at his or her disposal to try and retrieve some semblance of the historical accuracy in the Passion narratives is to slowly strip away the theological overlay imposed by the evangelists on Jesus' final days and return to the most primitive version of the story that can be excavated. And so I'm reading this and I think, yeah, I'm fully on board with that. That sounds great.
How?
But how? How do
Yeah.
you do this? How do you look at something like the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John with their, in some ways similar, but in some ways very divergent portrayals of Jesus and begin to sort of formulate a method and process for sort of thinking about, okay, they say this happened, do we think that's true? Maybe, maybe not. How do you go about when you
Yeah.
sort of start studying these materials? What's your process for just
Well,
interpreting?
As many people in this room are familiar with, I mean, the methodological tools that are at our disposal to try as much as possible to figure out what in the Gospels is more likely historical and what is less likely historical have been in place for some 2 centuries, and they involve a whole host of different, processes. I mean, I guess to put it in its simplest way possible, it's just simply a matter of taking the claims of the Gospels and analyzing them in light of what we know about the history of the time in which the Gospels were written and the time in which the Gospels are describing. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think it begins with an understanding of how to read the Gospels, or for that matter, sacred history in any form. And I think it requires us to recognize that there is a difference between truth and fact in the ancient mind, and particularly when dealing with sacred history, that they are not the same thing. They are the same thing for us. We think that that which is true is that which can be empirically verified. That's our very definition of history, indeed, that history is an accumulation of empirically verifiable facts. But that definition of history, as we are mostly aware, is quite a new idea. It's a product of the modern world. For the gospel writers, the notion of history was not about uncovering facts. It was about revealing truths. And so I think starting with that principle, knowing how to read the Gospels is the first step to figuring out how to then extract history out of them. Because, of course, these are not historical documents in the way that we think about them. I mean, the gospel writers are not writing about Jesus the way that a historian writes about Napoleon. These are testimonies of faith written by communities of faith. The gospel writers, in other words, already had they'd already decided who Jesus was. They'd made a judgment about his identity, that he was either the Messiah or the Son of God, or indeed God himself. And then they wrote their Gospels to prove that belief. So I guess to put it in the simplest way, these are not so much historical accounts of a man named Jesus of Nazareth. They are a theological argument about something called the Christ. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the question then becomes, are these just sort of theological arguments? Do we have to take them sort of at that level? Or is there something sort of underneath, sort of a hidden sort of series of events that we can then trace from these narratives? And I'm wondering sort of how you see yourself as going about sort of looking at what's underneath that theological overlay.
I think that some would say that there isn't. There are a number of scholars of religion of the New Testament who have more or less abandoned the entire project altogether, that the historical Jesus is inaccessible to us. This is all myth and legend, and you should only read the Gospels for its theological truths and just give up on trying to kind of extract a historical kernel out of them. I disagree. I do believe that there are methods to give us at least some sense of confidence in parts of the story. It involves, of course, trying to get as close to the events as possible. I mean, that's a big part about it. And it's also important to kind of try to not so much extract history, but to be aware of theology. So in other words, it's much easier to read the Gospels and point out the Christological aspects of it. They're obvious, they're out there. The difficult part is to then sort of sweep the Christology apart and say what's left. And then from what's left, it's about mining it. It's about figuring out what fits the history. Because, as I say, while it is true that we know very, very little about the historical Jesus, we know a great deal about the world in which he lived. And if you begin with the assumption, and it is an assumption, that whatever else Jesus was, he was a product of his world, that his views about the nature of God, the relationship between creator and creation, the concept of Jewish history and theology, his understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures were more or less in line with the general assumptions about these things, then you can place him firmly in that assumption and allow his world, his time to kind of define him. If, on the other hand, you believe that Jesus was utterly unique, that his conception of God, his conception of the Messiah, his reading, his interpretation of the Scriptures were innovative and unprecedented, then that doesn't work, because then it doesn't do you much good to see him in this context. So that's an admission that I think all scholars have to make, is that you have to begin with the assumption that Jesus was extraordinary, remarkable, but not unique. And once you begin with that assumption, then you can use his world to define him.
Yeah, that's great. You make this distinction throughout your book between the Jesus Christ and Jesus of Nazareth. In other words, the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history. And sort of so much of what the work you're trying to do is to uncover that Jesus of history. And I'm curious about sort of what you see is at stake for us today. We're both either as scholars, as people who consider ourselves Christians, as people who just admire Jesus but may not be Christian. What is at stake for you if we sort of just accept the Jesus of faith that's so often presented to us and leave that Jesus of history that you try to get at in this book, if we leave that part of his life unattended and unexamined? What do you see?
That's a very good question. Well, I think that even at the heart of Orthodox Christianity, of course, is that Jesus was both fully God and fully man. I have to tell you that even when I was a Christian, I had an incredibly difficult time making sense of that mystery. And I get it that it's a mystery. I get it. It's not supposed to be easy to understand. I understand that. But let me tell you what I mean by this. It's because, well, first of all, to be honest, usually what the Jesus that you hear about is the God Jesus. You know, when you go to church, you hear about the God Jesus. When you you think about Jesus, when you look at even the creedal formulas around Jesus, they are all about who he is, not what he did or said, what his teachings are about. And even when you try, as a Christian, to think about the man part of Jesus, if you will, when you try to think about him as struggling or suffering, as anxious or scared, when you try to think about the humanity of him, it's very difficult to do so because, he's also God. I often compare it to watching a tightrope walker with a net underneath him. You know?
It's just not that interesting.
It's not that interesting. You just think, well, so he falls. So what? I guess what I wanted to do is take away the net and to say to a believing audience that if you are serious about this belief that Jesus was also a man, then you need to suspend that belief for a moment to truly absorb the consequences of it, to recognize that he was a product of his world, that his teachings were addressed to specific social ills, that his actions were in confrontation to specific political and religious powers, and that the man that arises from that understanding may not look like the man you expect. For non-believers, what I really wanted to do was provide a window into why this man is still important. You know, why, I mean, I truly, truly believe, I mean, I'm no longer a Christian, but I truly think of myself as a follower of Jesus. I mean, I really believe that I have fashioned my life, the way that I confront powers, the way that I think about social justice, is deeply influenced by Jesus. And I wanted to make that argument to non-believers, to say that you can be a follower of this man without being a Christian. And I think that, why is that important? Because there is probably no more significant individual in the world, certainly in the Western world, than Jesus. And he is an infinitely malleable thing. He can mean anything to anyone, which is what theology is about. But the Jesus of history is frozen in place. And while there are, of course, enormous debates about who he was and what he meant, those debates are firmly stuck within a time and place. And so whether you are a believer or not, you must be familiar with that time and place if you want to know anything about Jesus.
I want to turn now to this Fox News interview that I think...
I'm sorry, which Fox News interview?
There were a couple, right? Yeah. So, of course, that's all over YouTube. So you can find that anywhere if you want to watch the rest of it. But I think, certainly this interview has captivated, me and my colleagues here at Harvard Divinity School. It was all over my Facebook newsfeed when it first came out. People were horrified and shocked by this. And so I think one of the things people are wondering about is, what's going through your head when you're giving this interview and she's asking you these questions. Was this something you expected going into the interview? And if not, sort of what's running through your mind as this is sort of spiraling out of control in this way?
Well, look, I watch Fox News. I know what Fox News is about. And so I would be lying if I said that I didn't expect that this would come up. And when it was the first question, I thought, oh, okay, well, I'll just go ahead and answer that question, and then the second question, and the third question, and we stopped it there. But as you can imagine, it just keeps going. And really, it wasn't until about 5 minutes into the interview that it occurred to me that, oh, this is happening. This is what we're going to talk about for the entire 10 minutes. So, I mean, honestly, I was more confused than anything else. I didn't think twice about this. I mean, I have to just be honest with you. The interview was over, and I thought, that was weird. And I just forgot about it until it became this kind of phenomenon, which, as I was telling you before, very quickly stopped being about me. I mean, this was about me for about 24 hours. And then it became about these very important discussions about media and journalistic bias, religion and society, the role of academia in public life and in popular discourse, which it was delightful to me. I mean, these are the conversations that we all have amongst each other all the time and that nobody else listens to. And to have these discussions all of a sudden being had, not just in the media, but on social media and the sort of the popular realm was exhilarating.
Yeah. It's so much of the criticism that certainly comes out in this interview, but is also present in sort of what else has been written about the book. The heart of it seems to be, why would a Muslim want to write a book about Jesus? And as you say in your book, you outline on the second page sort of where your own religious affiliation and identity lies. But I think this is a question that certainly many of us in this room grapple with, is sort of this tension between the religious life that we may or may not have, the faith and spirituality on one side, and then the academic sort of scholarly side that we're all here, trying to cultivate. And so I think, the question is, where do you see, so how do you see those two spheres of our life intersecting? Do you think that you could have just as well written this book and not explicitly, come out and said, I am a Muslim, but I'm a scholar in the history of religion writing about Jesus? Do you think it's important to sort of acknowledge sort of our own backgrounds, or do you see that as a really different dimension from the scholarly one? How do you see
No, Jason,
those
that's
two
a
worlds
really,
interacting?
really good question, because there are two things happening in this video, and there's sort of what everyone picks up on, which is this kind of clear anti-Muslim bias of Fox News that they have managed to spin into ratings gold for the last decade or so, and good for them. They've managed to become very successful by trying to convince people that Muslims are going to sneak into their homes at night and eat their children. But there's something else going on here. And it's something that I think we in this room pick up on, and that is her inability, an inability that I think is shared by the vast majority of Americans, to even understand the concept of religion as an academic enterprise. I mean, I think for her, she just doesn't, what do you mean? How could you possibly write about religion from an objective, and by objective we mean as objective as we can be, an objective position, that it just, the very concept makes no sense to her at all. And I have to say, not only do I think that most Americans would agree with that statement, I mean, you're all in div school. Just be honest with me. How often do you sit on a plane and tell someone that you're at div school and they're like, oh my God, did I just cuss? I'm so sorry. Like, are you a priest? Are you being a priest? Is that what you're doing? Is that, because again, this idea that, no, I'm actually studying an academic discipline, in a scientific environment, is a completely foreign concept to a lot of Americans. And I have to be honest with you, that's our fault. It's because we do such a poor job of communicating our skills, our scholarship, our research, our theories to a popular audience. On the contrary, when we try to do so, we are immediately attacked by our colleagues and our superiors as unserious. That, of course, we have fostered this sense of distrust among the people over what we do and what our goals are. Of course, there are Buddhists in this room who write about Christianity. There are Christians in this room who write about Hinduism. There are Hindus in this room that write about Islam. And for us, it just makes perfect sense that we separate our faith, whatever that may be, from our academic research. But until we figure out how to communicate better with the outside world, the outside world, like we're on some sort of island, but we are kind of on an island. Until we figure out a way to actually do that, and not just do it, but to encourage it. I mean, look, if you are brave enough to say that you're going to ignore the criticisms that you're going to get from your colleagues because you are going to get criticized. In fact, it can be detrimental to your academic career to write a popular book, as you all very well know, unless you're willing to just deal with that, to face that, and continue to do so. This is what is at store for all of us.
Absolutely. I think that gets to the heart of one of the things that's so interesting about this book, and why I love this book, is because you can really just, it's an accessible writing style that you use. It's not sort of, as we've talked about here a little bit, and as you say in the book more, the arguments that you're really advancing are not particularly new. People have thought in this way about Jesus before, but what you've done is given it sort of an accessibility such that not only the scholar of religion can pick up this book and understand it, but sort of the layperson who's never taken a course in religious studies in their life can pick it up, understand the arguments you're making, and follow it from beginning to end. And so I'm curious, for those of us who want to go into sort of this academic field and are thinking about how do we write, how do we talk about things, sort of if you could just give us some practical advice in terms of what your own writing strategies are, what's your approach to sort of presenting history in this really accessible way?
Well, first of all, learn how to embed your research. Learn how to sort of take the methodology, because what we do here is 90% methodology. Oh yeah, and I have a thesis too. Flip it around. Take the methodology and hide it, put it all the way in the back, because the world doesn't care. The world will just take your expertise at face value, and it doesn't care how you came up with these ideas. Put that in the back, put it in the notes section, hide it. So that's, I think, the first and most important thing to do. Secondly, simplify. And I know that, again, this is where the criticism comes from a lot. And I get a lot of criticism from colleagues who say, oh, this is such a simplistic version of this. Yeah, that's right. It's a simplistic version of it. That's the point of it. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Again, that doesn't mean that you need to simplify your research. There's a place for your research. Again, that's in the back. Put it in the back. But your grandmother doesn't care about your methodology or your research. She just wants to get to your conclusion. And then I would say, finally, and this sounds easy to say, but learn how to write. We have such a specialized writing style in academia with our own secret language that no one can decipher, and that only we ourselves understand. It's like the secret code that we talk to each other about. You have to get past that. You have to get over that. As you were saying, so when I finished Harvard, I had already gotten into a PhD program. And I made a conscious decision to defer entry and instead go and get an MFA in writing and to learn how to write, because I always knew that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to communicate these incredibly fascinating and consequential ideas that we all sit around in our classrooms talking about, which, I mean, you wouldn't be here if you didn't think that they were cool, right? I mean, that's why you're here. That I wanted to communicate that to people who aren't here, and I needed to know how to write in order to do that. But I got punished for that when I got into the program at Berkeley, and they gave me this very wonderful fellowship, and I said to them, I'd like to defer for 2 years. They said, why? I said, because I want to go get an MFA. And they said, well, of what? I want to go, get a writing degree. They couldn't understand. What do you mean? Why would you want to do that? And ultimately, they punished me for it. They said that, okay, well, we'll hold your seat, but not your fellowship. But you won it once. I'm sure you'll win it a second time. And they didn't give it to me the second time. And so, in other words, their argument was, you are now a weaker candidate because of this other degree. Not a stronger candidate. That's got to change. Absolutely. That has to change. And that, I think, is the ethos of academia. It has to change. But this is the last thing that I want to say, is that I think it's already changing. I think that, when I speak to university students and graduate students, what I'm confronted with is a different kind of scholar than I remember when I was a student. A scholar that is much more engaged in popular media and in popular discourse, a scholar that's not afraid to break through the ivy walls. And I think so it may take a generation or two more, but I think it's happening, and it can only be good for our society.
Absolutely. Well, I want to turn now to the question and answer part of the event, because I'm sure you're all, this has raised many questions for you all, and I want to give you a chance to speak with Reza a little bit. And so what we have runners on each side who are going to be going up and down the aisles with microphones. And so if you could just raise your hand if you have a question that you'd like to ask, one of the runners will come and give it to you. And we ask that you do speak into the microphone so that it can go on the recording and we can hear it for all of eternity. So I'll turn it over to you all. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hello, I'll start. Thank you for coming, by the way. Loved the Fox News interview, that was great. My question is actually to your point, the popularizing of theory, basically, and what we do here. How do you reconcile that with the sciences, with popular science? I mean, popular science gets kind of the same backlash, but when we try to speak to other scientists, when we take the study of religion scientifically and academically, when we speak to them, they don't understand what we're doing either.
Right.
And I am referencing your debate with Sam Harris here.
You're right.
Which I want to talk to you about that. But so how do you reconcile those two things is basically my question.
Yeah, it's funny. We were actually joking about this earlier about how the problem with religion is that everyone thinks that they're an expert in it, you know? And Sam Harris and the whole sort of new atheist movement is a perfect example of this. These are people who have the most unsophisticated understanding of religion, who, in my view, read scriptures more literally than any literalist I've ever met. And who then speak, from this position of faux expertise, which should drive some of us nuts. As I said to Sam myself, as I said, I don't write books about neuroscience. Do you know why? Because I'm not a neuroscientist. That's not what I do. But if you can read the Bible, you're an expert. In religion. You're right, it's a difficult situation. I will say that the one thing that a lot of other academic positions have, academic scholars have that religion doesn't, is they are immediately seen as sort of experts as a result of their degrees. So in other words, if we're having a conversation about the climate, we would assume that we would have that conversation, like if you're maybe not Fox News, but let's just say you're CNN, and you want to talk about global warming, very likely you're going to bring on a climate scientist to talk about that. If you want to talk about religion, you bring on some activist, or some religious leader, not an expert on religion. So I think that's the kind of idea that I'm talking about that we have to change. But that responsibility rests on us. If you're waiting for the media to change, you're wasting your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Question on this side? Go for it. Yeah.
Hi, Reza. Thank you for coming. So, like other people here, after watching the Fox News interview, I found myself watching other interviews because, YouTube's a downward spiral in that way. And I saw your interview on Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough, and I saw him struggling with this idea that there's a difference between myth and fiction. And he was struggling as a faithful Christian to accept what you were saying. And almost seemed hurt. And so at that point I was wondering, like Jason asked you, what you expected or what you hoped faithful Christians would get out of your book.
Yeah.
And I really liked the tightrope example that you gave and reminding us that Jesus is fully God and fully human. But something that wasn't discussed in the Fox News interview is that Jesus is very much a part of Islam also. A very real human in Islam, and he is not God also in Islam. So how would you present this book to a faithful Muslim who has a hard time accepting, for example, that the crucifixion did happen historically?
Very good. First of all, I am not proud of the Morning Joe interview because I think I lost my cool just a little bit. In that one because I was being harangued by Joe Scarborough. I would get like 3 words in, and he would say, "Oh, so you're saying it's a lie? It's all a lie, huh? It's all a lie." And it's like, no, it's myth. Oh, oh, so it's fiction. I was like, no, myth doesn't mean fiction. Myth means stories about gods and goddesses. That's what myth means. And I found myself trying to explain, academic terms to someone who was having a deep emotional reaction, rather than simply recognizing it, slowing down, and doing what we need to do, which is to respond to someone where they are at. But to this kind of larger issue about how to deal with faith as a scholar of religions, I think that's a really important question, and it's one I take to heart because, I write about Islam, I write about Judaism, I write about Christianity, and I, unlike many of my colleagues, actually take faith seriously. Come on, let's face it. A lot of our professors look at faith the way that a biologist looks at a microbe. It's this thing to be studied. Look at these strange people and they're believing in God. Mm-hmm. I remember the first week of my doctoral program, we were in this small seminar having this deep conversation about the problems of essentializing the sacred. And halfway through, I realized, oh, you mean believing in God. I see. Okay, you know why people hate us? Because we use phrases like essentializing the sacred. That's why. That's why they hate us. So I take faith seriously. I am not interested in attacking faith. I'm not interested in contradicting faith. I'm not interested in converting faith. So what I try to do is, even as I talk about religion from a historical or cultural or literary, scientific perspective, I never lose sight of the fact that what I am talking about is deeply a part of someone's identity. And you can very quickly get to the point where they feel as though their very sense of self is under attack by what you are doing. And so I sort of lay out the ground rules. I make sure that everybody understands that faith is not religion, that they are two completely different things, that every story that I analyze can be understood in two different ways, two modes of knowing, that you can talk about what is possible. Is it possible that Jesus thought he was God? Yeah, it's possible. Is it likely? No, it's not likely. And my job is to tell you what's likely. Your job is to think about what's possible. And those two things don't need to be in conflict with each other. When there is a conflict between scripture and history, in the case of the Quran statement that Jesus was not crucified, which of course is a very old story. You can find it in Gospels that were written in the 2nd century. The Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, and one can very easily trace the historical progression whereby those ideas were filtered into the Arabian Peninsula and were picked up by the Prophet Muhammad and became part of the Quran. But again, it's important to then just sort of constantly make a differentiation between the historian's job and the person of faith's job, these two modalities, and how, while they are different perspectives, they're not necessarily in conflict with each other. From a spiritual perspective, let me just say one more thing, because I am a person of faith, and I take my faith very seriously. But my faith is not in any religion. I am not a Muslim because I think Islam is right, or that Islam is true, whereas other religions are not. All religions are merely languages made up of symbols and metaphors that help us to describe what is inexpressible, which is faith. And a language is a language. A language is a language. I mean, it's like French or Spanish, I speak Arabic, I speak Spanish and French and Persian, but I think in English. So I speak Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, but I feel in Islam. That's the only difference for me. So if I find a conflict between history and scripture, it's history that's right, not scripture. My faith isn't in the scripture. In fact, to be honest with you, I am always baffled by people who say things like, I believe in the Bible, or I believe in the Quran. I don't understand what you're talking about. You believe it exists? So do I. These are not things to believe in. They are, to use a Sufi phrase, signposts to God. They are not the end in and of themselves. They are a means to an end. If your faith is in a text, you're doing it wrong.
Thank you for your question. Let's take one from this side.
My question is, how do you take complex ideas and simplify them without perpetuating ignorance? And so a kind of background of that is, like, we talked about new atheists, which let's assume for a second comes out of ignorance. There will be very intelligent, very nuanced, secular humanist scholars who will write popular books which will get picked up, and basically the simplicity of the ideas is what will get communicated by people, and you might come up against those people and be frustrated at their ignorance and how they're simplifying everything, and they're not willing to engage because they've just taken the idea. So seeing that on the other side, you've got to believe that it's going to be true on your side. So how do you make sure your distilling of complex ideas into simple ideas does not just perpetuate more ignorance?
It's very good. Well, specifically speaking, I would say that there is a difference between an evolutionary biologist who writes a book about, why religion is stupid and evil, right? I wouldn't say that that's simplifying it. I would say that that's just simply not having any conception of what religion is, where religion comes from, and how religion is understood. It is the easiest thing in the world to scour the scriptures for bits of savagery and then make general assumptions about it. There's nothing intelligent about that process. But to your larger question of how do those who are an expert in it, so in the case of Dawkins, when he writes a popular book about evolutionary biology, I'm sure evolutionary biologists say, oh my God, this is a really simplistic version of this argument. That's a better way of thinking about it. Or if a scholar of religion writes a book about religion, and I don't know if I have the answer to that. But at the very least, what I have tried to do is ameliorate that criticism by writing my books in such a way that they offer something to both audiences. So if you look at this book, at the very beginning of this book, it says this is actually two books. The main narrative is just a really good story that if you just trust me, and if you're not interested in the scholarship behind this and you're just going to follow my argument, you're going to enjoy. And I would say 90% of the people who read this book just read that first part of it. But then I say, but if you are not one of those people, if you actually want to know, the 2-century-long argument and debate over how I got to this narrative, and all the people who disagree with me about it, there's this second part of the book. And rather than do sort of simple endnotes or simple footnotes, what I've done is taken my notes and put them into narrative form as well. So if you read the last 90 pages of this book, it actually reads like a book. It actually reads like a parallel book. And that's what I really wanted it to do, so that for those who say, yeah, but how do you know? Or where do you get that? There is an answer for that, but it's separate, it's different, it's set apart. Now, I wish more people would read that, to be honest with you. I mean, I remember this one, I think it was a Nation reviewer who was a scholar at Barnard, who in the review literally said, because the book didn't come with traditional footnotes, it became very difficult to read the notes, and so I abandoned doing so. And then went on to criticize me for making unsubstantiated claims. It's like, they're not unsubstantiated, they're in the notes that you just said you did not read. So I guess that's the thing, is that understand your audience and try to satisfy them both, but not at the same time.
Yeah. We have time for one more question, so we'll take from this side.
I read your first book a few years ago, and I read your most recent book a couple of months ago, and I enjoyed them both, and I thank you for your scholarship. They were simplistic, of course, but I enjoyed them very much. And it occurred to me, were you a Christian when you wrote the book about Muhammad, or?
No.
No, okay. So my real question is, you were a Christian for a while, and I don't know if disillusioned or skeptical or whatever the right word is, but why didn't you just become a Unitarian like most of us?
Very good.
What a question to end on.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Well, look, okay, so let's go back to what I was saying about what religion is. A set of symbols and metaphors that provide a language to describe and to express faith to yourself and to other people. Those symbols and metaphors are what truly matter. And I suppose the best way to answer that question is the primary symbol for God in Islam, as opposed to Christianity, was what made the difference. The primary symbol for God in Christianity is man. That's the primary metaphor. And by the way, that makes perfect sense. I mean, truly, if you want to think about the sort of the long view of the history of religions, you can really make an argument that it has all been about this attempt to bridge the gap between creator and creation. And that's truly, that bridge is what religion is. It's a way of bridging that gap, bringing man, humanity, and the divine together. Part of the reason why Christianity, in my view, has been so enormously successful, it is the largest religion in the world, is because it figured out a way to remove the gap. The answer for Christianity is that there is no gap, that God and man are one. And so if you want a central metaphor to think about the other, the sort of divine transcendence, that which is by definition beyond, and that is in the sense that the human mind is incapable of grasping, the metaphor to grasp it is a man. I'm a human being. I know what it means to be a human being, and so therefore I start to endow that transcendent present with human attributes. God is good. God is love. These are human attributes. They do not apply to God, but they help you make sense of what God is. So do you see what I'm saying? So the central metaphor in Christianity is man. God is a man. That's how you think about him. The central metaphor for God in Islam is quite different. It's called Tawheed. It's embedded in this sort of the notion of the Shahada, that there is no God but God, which is often misunderstood as being a statement of monotheism. It's not. That statement doesn't mean that there is only one God. It means that God is in and of himself oneness, that God is divine unity, that his definition is one, that therefore he is utterly indivisible. And right, yes, but Unitarians still take the Jesus part, not anymore. Maybe I'm thinking of the UCC. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. Of course, there's a consequence to that belief. There's a consequence to the notion of Tawheed, which means that there can be no division between creator and creation. That if anything that exists only insofar as it shares in the existence of God, because God is the only thing that exists. So perhaps what I should do is is I simplified it. I'm going to make it a little bit more complex. It's not that I don't believe that Jesus was God. I just don't believe that Jesus was exclusively God. I think that, my central metaphor for God requires everyone and everything to be God. And it just makes more sense to me. And that's it. There's no other reason why I have chosen Islam over anything else. The Buddha once famously said that if you want to draw water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. Well, I want to draw water, and so Islam is my 6-foot well, but I also understand that the water that I am drawing from is the water that everybody else around me is drawing from.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Reza, for joining us so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
It was great.